Diolch am ymuno ni yng Nghanadledd Cenedlaethol Seren 2018. Ewch yn bellach. Thank you for joining us in the Seren National Conference 2018, Above and Beyond. Dyma sesiwn. This is session Gwleidyddiaeth, Athroniaeth ac Economeg, Politics, Philosophy and Economics.
Okay, my name is George. I am doing a PhD at the University of Leeds. I hate hearing my voice through a microphone. And in my course here, my class has two purposes to it, right? First thing I want to do is give you an understanding of how philosophy works, how you do philosophy. So give an understanding of the kinds of questions that philosophers work on. And second, give an idea of the methodology, the how you do philosophy, right? How philosophers attempt to answer the questions that they're interested in. So the subject matter and the methodology of philosophy. And I'm going to try to do this by using one thing that I work on, the free will debate, as a case study in how you do philosophy and how work in philosophy relates to work in the various sciences, for instance. So I want to give an overview of the philosophical study of free will, what it's about, some of the competing fundamental views that you find in the free will debate, and how that philosophical work is related to scientific work. You're going to have to bear with me. I'm sick, so there might be a point where I start coughing or sneezing into the microphone. So it's notoriously difficult to define philosophy as an academic discipline. What I give you here are a couple of quotations that are pretty popular among philosophers. First among these is a quotation from Wilfrid Sellars, 20th century philosopher, American philosopher. He says, "The aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things, in the broadest possible sense of the term, hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term." Right? To you, that's probably meaningless, right? Philosophers who have worked in philosophy for some time love this quotation because it gets at the idea that philosophy is sort of the study of the ultimate nature of reality, how things might or must or could be. A second quotation that's very common is from Elizabeth Anscombe, a 20th century British philosopher. She says, "Philosophy is thinking hard about the most difficult and ultimate questions." All that tells you really is that philosophy is tough, like any other kind of academic discipline. But she does mention that its concern is with, in some sense, the most ultimate, the most fundamental kinds of questions we can ask. So I think the best way, most people agree, the best way to get an idea of what philosophers work on is not to give some definition, but to look at some of the kinds of questions, right, that they're tackling. So it's generally identified that there are three main areas, three core areas to philosophy. First among these is an area called metaphysics. In metaphysics, philosophers ask really fundamental, typically abstract questions like, into what categories can things be classified, right? The kinds of things that could or might exist in the world, what kinds of categories can we put those things into, and how do things in the different categories relate to one another? What's the nature of causality, right? So in the various empirical sciences, in physics, chemistry, psychology, economics, and so on, scientists are concerned to discover what causes what out there in the world, right? So if this government puts in place this sort of monetary policy, how is that going to influence economic decision-making, saving, spending, and so on? The chemist wants to know, if we put these two substances together, what kind of result, what kind of effect might ensue? The physicist might ask, if we bombard this subatomic particle with this one at this speed, what kind of effect might happen? The philosopher working on metaphysics is interested in the more abstract fundamental question, what does it mean to say that one thing causes something else to happen? That is, what is the nature of causality itself? What are time and space? Do abstract entities like numbers and propositions exist? Very abstract question. A second fundamental area of philosophy is an area called epistemology. Epistemology is just a fancy word for the theory of knowledge or justification. So in epistemology, you ask, what is knowledge? Can we really know anything at all? You ask, what does it take to have knowledge, right? What's required? What's the correct account of knowledge? What's required to have knowledge, to have a belief that counts as full-blooded knowledge? What does it take for a belief to be justified? Even if a belief doesn't count as full-blooded knowledge, maybe it can still be justified. What does it take for that to be the case? How does justification relate to truth? What are the sources of our knowledge? That is, where do the various kinds of knowledge that we might come to have, where do they come from? You might think that mathematical and logical knowledge comes from a different place than empirical knowledge, like your knowledge that it's raining outside right now. How much can and do we really know? You might accept a strong conception or a strong account of knowledge that rules out that we really know much of anything at all, and then you might focus on the question, well, how strong is the justification that we have for our various beliefs? These are some of the fundamental questions in epistemology. Finally, ethics. Ethics should be more familiar, right? If you've ever taken, I think some students might have done some work in free will or ethics at maybe the KS4 level, maybe in a religious education class. But generally, ethics, moral philosophy is much more familiar than these other two areas to us. In ethics, we ask questions like, is there objective right and wrong in the world? And if there is, where does it come from? What, if any, actions are right or wrong in particular circumstances? Can a person, this is a question related to the free will debate, what I'm going to talk about today, can a person ever be morally responsible for what she does or for who she is, the person she is? You might ask questions like, are actions like stealing and lying and killing, are they always wrong in all circumstances or just sometimes? What does it take to make them wrong? What does it take to make them acceptable? These are philosophical questions. And you might ask, okay, so how exactly do you do? How do you answer these questions? Contrast philosophy with the scientific method, right? Which you probably have a rough idea how it works. I'll put things very roughly here. In science, in the empirical sciences generally, you follow this method where you formulate some question, you develop a hypothesis, you make predictions based on that hypothesis about what might happen. You test that prediction either via some controlled experiment in a laboratory or out there in the world, or just via observation. And then over time, right, with repeated results, confirmations of your predictions and hypotheses, after analyzing results, you eventually develop full-blooded scientific theories based on the cumulative evidence that you've acquired, right? This isn't how philosophy works, though. Philosophy isn't an empirical science. Philosophers can't, in answering philosophical questions, can't follow the scientific method to get at any results. So in philosophy, it's often said is done from the armchair, right? Philosophical views are developed by means of careful thinking and reasoning about abstract matters, right? Matters that have to do with questions that you can't go out there in the world and point to, right? You can't go out there in the world and point to something and say, that's where objective right and wrong comes from. That's the nature of right and wrong. Or this is what it takes to have knowledge, right? You have to think carefully and reason about things, form philosophical views and positions, conclusions based on arguments, right? So just as scientific positions are based on good scientific evidence, philosophical positions, philosophical views have to be based on evidence of their own, evidence in the form of reasons for accepting various positions as true. So these kinds of questions here are not questions you can answer by doing science, is what I'm trying to say. These are questions that you can only answer, if at all, if they have answers, and presumably most of them do, by thinking carefully, by reasoning about what it takes to have knowledge, what it takes for a belief to be justified, what it takes for something to count as an instance of causality. So, the free will debate. Take this as a case study in one topic in philosophy. It's what I work on. It's the primary focus of my PhD. What is it about? If I were to run up to you guys before we entered this session here, right? Supposing most of you haven't thought about free will before, maybe some of you have. But if I were to run up to you with a microphone and a TV camera and say, tell me everything you think about free will, what would you think that I was on about in the first place? What does the term free will, what kind of thoughts does that strike up in your head? What do you think free will is about? Somebody give me a guess. Yeah. Yeah, good. Your ability to make your own decisions, maybe not impeded by other people, right? Forces from the outside in some sense. Any other thoughts? Does that sound pretty good? We're going to go with a traditional definition of free will, which is along these lines. Free will is a power or an ability or a capacity to make conscious choices, right? So mental actions. Choices are mental actions. Free will is a power or ability to make conscious choices about how to act, about what to do, where these choices are in some important sense up to or determined by the person who makes them. So we have to leave things kind of vague here. In the free will debate, we're going to see that we're going to look at a fundamental question, the compatibility question. We're going to ask whether free will is compatible with causal determinism. And we want the two sides, right, the two possible answers to that question. We want them to be agreeing. We want them to be starting out with the same definition or conception of free will in the first place. So we're leaving things kind of general here. Free will is a power or ability to make conscious choices about what to do, where in some sense, in some important sense, those choices are up to or determined by the person who makes them. From here, we're going to go on to give more specific accounts. We're going to fill in the blanks. We're going to fill in the in some important sense, right? Make more sense of that. So there are two fundamental questions about free will in the free will debate. First is the question, what's the correct account of free will? That is, to give an account of something is to say what it takes to have that thing. So what does it take for something, for some kind of creature, a human being or some other kind of creature, to have free will? This, I say, is a philosophical question. It's not a question that you can answer by doing science, by following the scientific method. It's only a question that you can answer by doing careful thinking and reasoning. Second, do any human beings, the kind of creature we are, do any human beings ever have free will? Ever have and exercise free will? That is, do we ever make choices that are in some sense, in some important sense, up to us or determined by us? This, I say, is in part a scientific question, because answering this question, it requires knowing something about what science says about human beings, right? If you want to really fully and adequately answer this second question, you have to know, for instance, what psychology tells us about conscious and unconscious mental processes in humans, what neuroscience tells us about how the brain works, what biology tells us, maybe what cognitive science tells us. You have to know something, in other words, about what human beings as a particular kind of natural organism are actually like. Notice that the second question isn't just a scientific question. It comes after the first one, right? I've ordered this number 2, because in order to answer the second question, you have to have already answered the first philosophical question, right? To answer the question whether humans have free will, you have to have in mind already an account of what it takes to have free will. You have to know what you think it takes to have free will. Then you can see whether human beings, in fact, meet that account, right? So, some reasons to care. I'm doing a PhD that's taken me, including the master's, 5, 6, 7 years. I have to write something like 80 to 90,000 words for my thesis. It's a big investment. Am I wasting my time? Why should I even care about the question of what it takes to have free will and whether human beings have free will? Any thoughts? Do you feel like free will is something worth having? As we've defined it here, this power or capacity to make choices that are in some important sense up to you, does that sound like something worth having, something you'd want? Why? Yeah. Why does that matter, though? I'm sure you've got in mind the right thing, but... Huh? Yeah, it means that we have a kind of say or control, right? Do a little thought experiment here. Suppose that God came down and made you this deal, offered you this deal. God said, you can either have genuine free will. You could have free will. You could have it be the case that at least some of the choices that you make in your life about what to do, not just mundane choices like what to eat for breakfast, what color socks to wear today, but some of the really important, meaningful choices like, should I go to university? What university should I go to? What kind of course should I pursue? Should I marry this person? Should I pursue this kind of career? Should I have children, right? The really meaningful questions that have strong long-term implications for your life and other people's lives. Suppose God says at least some of those choices really are going to be up to you or determined by you in some important, meaningful sense. So on the one hand, you could have free will. That's option 1. Or option 2, you're not going to have free will. God, I'm going to make every decision for you. I'm going to cause every decision that you ever make in your life. You're not going to realize it because who's seen the movie Men in Black? Yeah, suppose God has one of those really cool little pens, right? And after you have this conversation about this deal, God hits the button, God puts on his sunglasses, and your memory goes away. You don't remember this deal being offered to you, right? So you're going to go, if you pick option 2, you're going to go through life thinking that it's you making all these choices, right? Thinking your choices are up to you, but really behind the scenes, it's God doing all the work. But God says, if you pick this second option where I make all your choices for you, they're always going to be the right choices. I'm always going to cause you to choose the right thing. It's always going to be the best possible choice in that situation so that your life goes very well. Who would pick option 1? Who would pick option 2? Do you feel there's some pause though, right? Do you have to kind of think about it a little bit? Do you feel if you're going for option 2, if you're going for the option where God makes all your choices for you, but your life goes really well, do you feel at least a little bit of hesitation? Anybody? Why? There's a couple of reasons you might have in mind. Yeah.
I was going to say, if my life is going great, then it's up to God. It's not up to me. I didn't do that. So I can't take responsibility for it. I can't be proud or I can't be truly happy that I did something.
Good. Just like you were saying here, right? One reason for caring about free will is that if we really had it, if it was the case that at least some of the choices we make in our lives are up to us or determined by us, that would mean we have a special kind of agency in the world, right? So to be an agent is just, in a general sense, just to be something that does stuff, that acts, right? Agency is a capacity or power to act. If we have free will, then we have a special kind of agency. We'd have a special kind of control over at least some small aspects of how things go in the world, right? Not just our own thinking, not just our own choices about what to do, but when those choices are successful, some of the consequences or results of those choices. And our own character, right? We make choices about what to do in our lives, choices that over time can affect the kind of person we are. So one reason to care about free will is it says something about our place in the world, right? Contrast a creature that's capable of making choices that are really up to it or determined by it with a less sophisticated creature, right? Think of less sophisticated animals like cats and dogs. Maybe you think cats and dogs don't have full-blooded free will. Maybe we have to go even more basic than that. Look at spiders, right? Look at single-celled organisms, right? These are living creatures that do stuff, right? But there's no sense in which the things they do are up to them. They're determined by them. They don't really have a say. They're just operating according to their biological programming, right? Or compare having free will with being a sophisticated computer, right? Like a current computer, right? I think we can all agree that computers that exist right now at least don't think. They have no kind of mental life. They don't even make choices in the first place, right? A computer just does stuff. I can send the computer inputs through a keyboard or something. The computer spits out some output. It might send an image to a screen. It might send information to a printer to print out some document or some 3D object. But the computer's just operating according to programming that was written for it by some person, by some human being. The computer has no say in what it's doing, right? On the other hand, if we make choices about what to do that really are up to us or determined by us, then we have a special kind of agency that distinguishes us from all these other kinds of things in the world that do stuff, right? Some of our doings, some of our actions are special, right? They have a special kind of status. What's another reason? Why want to have this status in the first place, right? A couple of you have mentioned, right? It says something about it would make us like the author or the source of some of the things that we do, some of the things that happen in the world, right? It would give us ownership or autonomy over some of the things we do. Anyone think of another reason to care about whether we have free will or not? Think about the kinds of social practices that we have. When someone chooses to do something bad and then succeeds in doing that bad thing, what do we typically do in response to them, either as individuals or as a society? Yeah, we punish them, right? When people make good choices, sometimes we praise them, sometimes we reward them. When they make bad choices, if we catch them, sometimes we blame them, punish them. It seems that our moral responsibility practices and our legal responsibility practices of praising and blaming, punishing and rewarding people for their choices and for their actions depends upon their having exercised some kind of control in the history of that thing we're praising or blaming them for. And it seems that free will itself, it seems that making choices that are in some sense up to us or determined by us is a prerequisite for having moral responsibility for any of the things we do or fail to do or the kind of person that we are. So these are two significant reasons, I think, for caring about what it takes to have free will, that is, caring about what's required for free will, what the right account of free will is, and caring about the question whether human beings, creatures like us, at least mature, adult, relatively sophisticated humans, ever make choices that are up to them. So a fundamental question in the free will debate that I briefly mentioned is this compatibility question. This is the question, could we have free will? Would free will be possible? Would any of the choices that we ever make be up to us if the world was causally deterministic? What is causal determinism? Very roughly, for our purposes here, we're going to stay really rough with this. We're going to say causal determinism is the view that first, everything that ever happens anywhere in the world, right? So all the thoughts going on in your head, all the choices that you make, all the other actions that you perform, all the things happening in your immediate surroundings, the world around you, everything happening in distant corners of the universe that you're never going to see or experience, everything that's ever happened in the past, everything that ever will happen in the future, literally everything that ever will, has, or ever has, will, or is happening has a cause first, right? Isn't random or uncaused. So everything has a cause. And second, that cause determined or necessitated or guaranteed that that thing was going to happen just as it did. So causal determinism is the view that everything that ever happens has a cause or a set of causes, and that cause or set of causes guaranteed the thing was going to happen just as it did. Typically when undergrads see this question for the first time, see the compatibility question, and get their head around what a causally deterministic world would look like, they think, well, no, clearly that wouldn't leave any kind of room for free will. That would rule out free will, right? If everything that happens in the world, including all the choices I'm making about what to do, about how to act, are just guaranteed in advance, predetermined by things that came before them, which are their causes, then how can any of those choices be up to me or determined by me? But as it turns out, philosophers working on these topics, on free will and moral responsibility these days, it's probably the case that more people say, yes, you could have free will if the world was causally deterministic, than say no. So there are two positions here, right? Is free will compatible with causal determinism? If you say yes, if you say you could still have free will in a causally deterministic world, then you're what's called a compatibilist, right? You think free will and causal determinism are compatible with one another. If you say no, straightforwardly enough, you're an incompatibilist. And it does seem the literature is, these days, the last few decades at least, since some prominent papers published in the 60s and 70s, most philosophers go for compatibilism, which surprises undergrads when they see that. So let's talk about what the compatibilist thinks it takes to have free will, right? Let's talk about a compatibilist account of free will. The view, right, what compatibilism says is that causal determinism itself wouldn't be a threat to free will. We can still have free will, even if the world's deterministic, as long as some important conditions are met. So first, the compatibilist wants you to be able to understand reasons as such, right? What that means is, anytime you're thinking about what to do, when you're in a circumstance where you're thinking about how to act, what to do, you're aware of at least two alternative courses of action, right? Two paths that you may follow. At least two apparent paths, two seeming possibilities, maybe more than two. But typically you're also aware of reasons for and against following each of those paths, right? Pros and cons for each of the options that you're aware of. The compatibilist, if you're going to have free will in a causally deterministic world, the compatibilist wants you to understand reasons for acting in a certain way as reasons for acting in that way. That is, they want you to understand reasons when you have a reason for doing something or against doing something. They want you to recognize that thing as a consideration that speaks in favor of or against acting in that way. So suppose I'm thinking about whether to rob a shop, right? There's a corner shop, little convenience store as we call it. And I'm thinking about whether to rob it, right? And maybe I know that the till, the cash register in that shop, has a couple £100, and if I rob the shop, I'm going to get to go and buy an Xbox, and I really want an Xbox One. All my friends have Xboxes, and I've been missing out. I'm really jealous, but if I rob this shop, I can go get myself an Xbox. That counts as a reason, right? That consideration, the fact that the till has the money I need to buy an Xbox, is a reason to rob the shop, right? But you might think there's going to be really good reasons for me not to rob the shop. First, you might think there's a moral or ethical reason not to rob the shop, namely, it's wrong, it's objectively wrong to take someone else's money and property. And you might think we could construe the case so that there's a police officer right outside, and I see that he's outside, and I have a feeling he's going to come in if I go in. And you might think that his presence, right, if I go in and rob the shop and he follows me and he's going to catch me, I'm going to go to jail. You might think that his presence is a reason not to rob the shop. Right, so there are these pros and cons, right? A normal person, a reasonable person in this circumstance would probably judge, based on the moral reason and the pragmatic reason of the police officer standing there, that the wrong thing to do, all things considered, the wrong thing to do is to rob the shop. So that person will just go home, right? After weighing the pros and cons. The compatibilist wants you to understand reasons for action as such, and kind of straightforwardly enough, the compatibilist wants you to be exercising free will. They want you to be not being subject to significantly strong compulsion from the inside or the outside, right? So take first compulsion from the inside. If you're suffering from the kind of severe mental illness that maybe causes, in a particular circumstance, delusions or hallucinations, and what you're doing, how you're thinking, and the actions you're performing are just the result of that psychological condition of yours, then, straightforwardly enough, most people are going to say that's not free will, right? Your actions are being brought about, determined, caused by this condition you're in. You yourself, the person you are, is not really playing any kind of role there. Similarly, the compatibilist wants your actions not to be compelled from the outside, right? So typically they'll talk about cases of coercion and manipulation, right? Coercion is when if I hold, philosophers like to use violent, gruesome examples. If I hold a gun to your head and say, give me your wallet, that counts as coercion, right? That's a case of coercion because I'm making a threat of bodily harm to you, or I could be coercing you by making a threat of harm to other people. If you don't do the thing I want you to do, in this case, give me your wallet, right? Or you could manipulate somebody. Manipulation takes different forms. The compatibilist is concerned with the kind of manipulation that would that would sort of compel, right, action. So we're always being subject to manipulation, right? When you drive home on your bus and you see a billboard for McDonald's and there's a big, juicy, disgusting-looking Big Mac on that billboard, right? That's manipulation. Advertising and marketing are trying to manipulate you into having certain thoughts, into thinking about things certain ways, and hopefully they think, into changing your behavior, right? Manipulating you into performing certain actions, like going to McDonald's to buy a Big Mac. But that's probably not the kind of manipulation that gets in the way of free will for ordinary people, right? Maybe you have the kind of self-control to think about things carefully and decide for yourself whether you're going to go to McDonald's and get a Big Mac. On the other hand, if I were to implant a microchip into your head, right? If I'm an evil scientist and I put a microchip in your head and everything that you ever do, every thought that you ever have, every action you ever perform is just caused by, is just brought about by that microchip, then clearly that would be the kind of case of strong manipulation where there's no free will going on, right? So the compatibilist says, first you've got to understand what it is. To have a reason for or against acting, you've got to understand what reasons themselves are, because compatibilists want free actions, free choices to be rational choices. They want them to be choices that are performed for reasons, typically. Second, they want you to not be subject to compulsion, strong compulsion from the inside or from the outside. Finally, they want your choices to be brought about, to be caused by the right things. So if the world's causally deterministic, then it's just true, by definition, that all of the choices that we make are determined, are caused and determined by things that occurred, by things that happened before them, right? And this might seem like a threat, right? For the incompatibilist, this is a threat. But the compatibilist says, no, it's okay if all of your choices are brought about by things that came before them, as long as part of what's doing that bringing about, part of what's necessitating or determining your choices are the right kinds of things. And typically they point to certain desires or certain beliefs that you might have. So to try to make sense of that briefly, suppose I'm thinking about whether to rob the shop and I judge, right? I think about the pros and cons of each of my options, right? There's this moral reason against stealing someone else's money. There's this practical reason having to do with the policeman standing outside. And there's the reason for robbing the shop, namely that the till has the money that I need to go buy an Xbox, right? Suppose I weigh the pros and cons carefully, like a reasonable person, and I decide that all things considered, right, the best course of action in this case, given the reasons for and against, right, my different options, all things considered the best course of action is not to rob the shop, right? Even setting aside the moral reason, the possibility of getting caught, right, the negative impact on my life of getting caught and thrown in jail is much greater than any positive impact of getting the money and buying an Xbox, right? The little bit of enjoyment I'd get out of that. So I think about things carefully and I decide, I judge that all things considered the best thing to do is not to rob the shop. If it's the case that judgment of mine, that belief of mine, my belief about what the best thing to do, all things considered, is, having weighed the pros and cons, if it's that belief that causes my choice, that causes and determines my choice not to rob the shop, then the compatibilist says, there you go. That can be a free choice. That can be a choice that's up to you or determined by you, because it's your best belief, right? It's not someone else's belief. It's your best belief about what to do that's causing, that's bringing about, that's guaranteeing the choice that you made. Or you might appeal to desires. Compatibilists often appeal to some combination of beliefs and desires. You might say that in this situation where I'm thinking about whether to rob the shop or not, I have conflicting desires as well as beliefs, right? I desire to be a moral person. I desire not to do morally wrong things. I desire not to go to jail, right? Not to get caught and go to jail. But I also desire the money, right? I really desire the money because I want the Xbox. You might have, as part of your story, you might have an appeal to your strongest desire. The compatibilist might say, if it's your strongest desire, if among those competing desires, the strongest one is the desire that causes, that plays a role in causing or bringing about your choice, whatever that choice is, then they say, there you go, free will. That means the choice can still be up to you or determined by you, even if all of this is happening within a world that's causally deterministic. One kind of popular compatibilist approach is to say that free will, right, making choices that are up to you, is a matter of having a desire that brings about that choice, that causes that choice, where you have a second order, where you have a second desire to desire that first desire. So if the strongest desire of mine is the desire to be a morally sound person, right, not to do moral wrongdoing, if my desire not to be morally bad is the desire that brings about my choice not to rob the shop, and it turns out that I have a desire on top of that to desire to be morally sound, right? To be the kind of person who doesn't rob from somebody else, for instance. then there's a sense in which I identify with that first order desire, right? I want to have the desire not to rob, not to steal someone else's property, right? And in virtue of having that second desire, the desire to desire, not to rob the shop, there's a sense in which I kind of have an ownership over that first desire, right? I want to have that desire, and it's that desire that's causing my choice not to rob the shop. So the compatibilist might say, there you go. What more could you want, right? It's not someone else's beliefs and or desires bringing about your choices. What more could you want than being able to understand reasons for and against different courses of action that you're aware of, not being subject to strong internal or external compulsion, and having your choices being brought about by your best belief or your strongest desire or some combination of these? What more could you want for free will than this, right? They're your beliefs and desires. They're not someone else's. It's okay, the compatibilist says, that the entire world, that everything that happens in the world is causally deterministic, as long as these sorts of conditions right here are met. The incompatibilist, of course, says, not so fast, right? They have various arguments against compatibilism, the most common, the most popular of which is something called the consequence argument. It's an argument that's been around for a long time. The formulation I'm going to give you here is just a brief summary from a guy named Peter Van Inwagen, a philosopher at Notre Dame in the U.S. who is still living. But as I've said, it's a problem that this argument's been around for a long time. It's kind of obvious. So the incompatibilist, it's going to be an argument, right? So it's going to take the form of premises and a conclusion, right? The incompatibilist starts out with this argument by pointing out that, look, if determinism is true, then our acts, right, all of the actions we perform, all of the choices that we're making, and all the other things we do are the consequence of laws of nature and events in the remote past. You can ignore the laws of nature part. Whether or not this argument needs to have mention of laws of nature in it depends on what you think laws of nature are. And if you're someone like me who thinks of laws of nature in a certain way, they're just kind of redundant in the argument, so you can ignore them. So ignore the laws of nature part and just focus on the events in the remote past, right? If the world's causally deterministic, then the definition of causal determinism is just a world where everything that ever happens is determined, is guaranteed by things that came before it, which are its causes, right? Premise one here is taking that definition and specifying that, look, if causal determinism is true, then all of your actions are determined not just by things that came just before them, but ultimately by events in the remote past, right? If all the choices that I make are determined by my beliefs and desires or brain states of mine in a causally deterministic world, then those beliefs and desires and brain states themselves are causally determined by things that came before them. Those things are causally determined by things that came before them, and so on, all the way back in time, right? So premise one of the consequence argument is just pointing out an implication of the truth of determinism. I should say, I meant to say earlier, we're not supposing that causal determinism is true, right? We're asking the question, if the world was causally deterministic, could we still have free will? Would that still leave room for free will? As it happens, even setting aside questions of human choice and behavior, it's an open scientific question in fundamental physics, whether the correct interpretation of evidence and the way that models work in physics is a probabilistic or a deterministic interpretation or something else. So it's an open question whether the world's really causally deterministic. We're not supposing it is or isn't. We're just asking the question, could you have free will if the world was deterministic? And the reason we're doing that is because answering that question in either of the two different ways, it's a yes or no question, right? Whether we say yes or no, we're going to go on to give different sorts of accounts of what it takes to have free will. So the incompatibilist giving the consequence argument just points out that, look, if determinism is true, all of the choices and other actions that you make are the consequence not just of what came just before them, right, immediately before them in time, but ultimately of things that happened way in the distant past, before you ever existed, before you were born. Second premise, this is also meant to be kind of straightforward and obvious, right? It's not up to us what went on before we were born, and it's not up to us what the laws of nature are. Ignore that part. It's not up to us. We have no control. We have no say over things that happened before we ever existed, right? That should be, you might think that's almost trivial. Conclusion, therefore, the consequences of these things, right? The consequences of events and circumstances in the remote past, including our present choices and other actions, are not up to us, that is, are not free, right? The conclusion is basically the conclusion that is an incompatibilist conclusion, right? You can't have free will if the world's causally deterministic. You can't make choices that are in some meaningful, important sense up to you or determined by you if the world's causally deterministic. And this is the argument. Now the compatibilist, what do I do next? Yeah. The compatibilist obviously isn't going to accept the consequence argument, and there's a long literature of arguments against it. You have different options, right? In philosophy, you build views, right? Any given view in philosophy is the conclusion of some argument, right? You have premises, reasons for accepting that conclusion, for accepting that view. When you have an argument like this is meant to be a deductive argument, right? It's meant to be an argument where the conclusion, if the premises are true, if those first two reasons are true, then the conclusion just has to follow, right? It just follows 100% sure. There's no maybe about it, right? If the premises are true in a deductive argument, then the conclusion just has to follow. And compatibilists have some different options about how they might attack this argument. They might try to attack either of the two premises, right? It would be really weird if they tried to attack premise one, because it seems that premise one, this first reason, is just true by definition of causal determinism. Compatibilists might, and some of them have, tried to attack premise two, the idea that it's nothing that happened before you ever existed could be up to you, or the idea that the laws of nature aren't up to you. But it takes some weird metaphysical commitments to go after that premise, right? What you could do instead, if you're a compatibilist, is you could say, yeah, those first two premises, there's nothing wrong with them. They're both good, but I don't think the conclusion follows from them, right? You could attack the inference to the conclusion from those two premises and say, these two premises, although they're true themselves, or although they're not objectionable themselves, you don't get the conclusion out of them. And I mean, the attack, right, the response from the compatibilists to this argument is just going to keep pointing to the fact that, look, if it's your best beliefs or strongest desires, right, if it's the right things that are involved in this causal chain, which dates back all the way back in time, if it's the right things that are involved in the causal determination of your choices about what to do and other behaviors you perform, what more could you want than that, right? What more could you want than your best beliefs or strongest desires determining just what choices you make about how to act? The incompatibilist is going to say, there is something more I want. You're missing something. Your picture doesn't have something that's essential to free will. So incompatibilism is the view that, of course, causal determinism is a threat to free will, right? You couldn't have free will, according to the incompatibilist, if the world was deterministic, because having free will requires having something called alternative possibilities. What does that mean? Straightforward enough. Alternative possibilities are just genuine options, right? Such that a person really could have chosen other than she actually did, holding everything equal up to the moment of choice. So if I'm thinking about what to do, I'm thinking about whether to rob the shop, right? I'm aware of these pros and cons, reasons for and against robbing the shop. Let's say that I eventually decide not to rob the shop, right? And let's say that I meet the compatibilist account and my decision not to rob the shop is either brought about by my judgment that overall, all things considered, the best thing to do is such and such, or my strongest desire, maybe to be a moral person or not to go to jail, right, not to get caught by the police officer. I meet the compatibilist account. I'm not being compelled from the inside or the outside, and I recognize what it is to have reasons, what it is to have considerations that speak for or against acting in different ways. If I'm meeting these compatibilist requirements in a deterministic world, in a world that's causally deterministic, then the choice that I end up making was guaranteed all along, right? When I was thinking about what to do, when I was deliberating, when I was thinking about what course of action I should take, it might have felt to me, right? It normally does feel to us like there are options, right? We could have done this or we could have done that. But in fact, if the world's causally deterministic, that wasn't the case. The choice that I actually ended up making was just the choice I was going to make all along, right? There's only one way the future could have unfolded if the world's causally deterministic. The incompatibilist says that's the kind of world where you can't have free will. What you need is alternative possibilities. In other words, it has to have literally been the case that you really could have chosen differently than you chose. So if I made the decision not to rob the shop, the incompatibilist says for me to have exercised free will in that case, it had to have been the case that I really could have chosen to rob the shop. And crucially, it had to have been the case that I really could have chosen to rob the shop, holding everything equal up to the moment of choice, right? So if there's a moment, if there's some time when I made that decision, the incompatibilist says you must have been able to make a different decision holding all of your beliefs and desires exactly as they were, right? So without changing any of my desires, without changing any of my beliefs, without changing any judgment I might have made that all things considered the best thing to do is such and such, it really has to have been the case, according to the incompatibilist, that I could have done the other thing instead. Incompatibilists divide. Most compatibilists, as it happens, are going to think that humans have free will, given what they require, right? So if the compatibilist requires that you understand what it is to have a reason for or against doing something, and you not be compelled in some sufficiently strong sense from the inside or from the outside, and it be the case that your choice be brought about by certain privileged of your beliefs and desires. Most compatibilists are going to think that ordinary humans, at least mature adult human beings, meet those requirements, right? So do have free will, at least on some occasions, right? You might think that human infants don't have free will, but an adult human that has patience, right, and can think about things carefully and deliberate about what to do, is the kind of creature that exercises free will, at least on some occasions. That's compatibilism, right? Most compatibilists, it'd be really weird for a compatibilist to think that no human being ever exercises free will. Incompatibilists, on the other hand, do divide fairly roughly into two camps. So take this question, given incompatibilism, given the view that free will is not compatible with causal determinism, do human beings, do the kind of creature that we are, ever have free will? You get a pretty clean division into two camps. On the one hand, you have skeptics, right? People who say no. If you're a skeptic about free will, then you think there's good reason to suppose that human beings don't have what it takes, right? Lack free will. Either because it's something about humans themselves, right? Something about our mental or cognitive makeup that gets in the way of having free will. Or you might think there's something about free will itself that's just altogether impossible. But if you're a skeptic, if you're an incompatibilist who's a skeptic, you think that free will is not compatible with determinism, and, as it happens, no human being ever exercises free will. On the other hand, if you're a libertarian, in the context of the free will debate, you're someone who thinks that free will and causal determinism are incompatible, but you think nonetheless that at least some human beings do exercise free will on some occasions. So if the libertarian's right about that, the libertarian thinks that some human beings do have free will. If they're right about that, then because they're an incompatibilist about free will and determinism, the truth of their view, the correctness of their view would mean that the world is obviously not causally deterministic. So libertarianism about free will, the view that first, incompatibilism is the correct position on the compatibility question, right? Free will and determinism are not compatible with one another. And second, the view that at least some human beings do have free will some of the time. There's often, if you're a libertarian about free will, you have two different sides that are going to attack you, right? You face attacks from compatibilists. Since you're an incompatibilist, you have to deal with objections from compatibilists, and you also have to deal with objections from skeptics, right? From other incompatibilists who are skeptical about the idea that humans have free will. And one common objection to libertarianism, to the idea that humans make choices that are really up to them at least some of the time, is the so-called luck objection. So the question is there a problem for the libertarian about free will concerning luck? And what we mean by luck here isn't good or bad luck, but luck defined as something that's not up to me, right? So if I walk out of here and I find a 20-pound note on the ground outside and there's no one around in the car park for me to give it to, that seems like good luck, right? There's my dinner paid for. But if I'm walking out of here and I step in a big puddle and I get mud all over my pants, that's bad luck, right? Because I wasn't paying attention, that's bad luck. They're both luck insofar as, set aside the good or bad part, they're both luck insofar as they're things that happened to me or things I did that I didn't have any control over, that weren't up to me, that I didn't have a say about, right? It wasn't up to me that the puddle was there. It might have been up to me that I was paying attention or not. But given that I wasn't paying attention, it's not up to me that the puddle's in my way. It's not up to me that the 20-pound note was on the ground there. So luck is just, in this context, luck is something's being not up to you or under your control, right? So the question is, if the world's not causally deterministic, right? Often compatibilists don't just think that you could have free will in a causally deterministic world. They think the world has to be causally deterministic for free will to exist. And they'll say if the world's not causally deterministic, right? If it's not the case that all of the choices we make are 100% determined in advance to occur, just as they do, then what's the case, right? If they're not guaranteed to occur by prior circumstances, then does that mean that they're partly a matter of luck? Does that mean that they're either random or chancy or probabilistic, something like that, right? If the chance of some choice that you make's happening isn't 0% or 100%, as it would be in a causally deterministic world, does that then mean that there's some chance or probability between 0 and 100, or else that the choice is just a random kind of event? That your choice about how to act is just a random occurrence? If that's the case, right, if it's random or chancy or probabilistic in this way, then the choice can't be up to you, right? If you don't have any control, you don't have any control sort of by definition over things that are random or chancy with respect to you. So if that's the case, if you don't have this kind of control, those things aren't up to you, they're not determined by you, so they're not free. These choices couldn't be free choices, exercises of free will. This is the luck objection that the libertarian has to deal with. And there's different kinds of response you might make here as a libertarian. You might accept the idea that there's some luck involved here, but say, in fact, it's not really problematic after all. Or you might go a different way and say, and deny the idea that there's any luck, that there's any chanciness or randomness or probability applying to choices that we make. And you might say that free choices are choices that aren't determined by anything in advance, but they're 100% determined by us at the time we make them. They're not random or lucky, because we determine them 100% by exercising a special kind of mental power to choose how to act, right? And then you have to give a story about that kind of mental power that shows why exercises thereof, right? Choices about what to do aren't lucky in some sense. That, in a nutshell, is sort of how the basics of the free will debate work. I'll close by talking briefly about skepticism about free will. So, as I said, if you're a compatibilist, right, you've got this compatibility question. Could you have free will in a deterministic world? And answering that question is part of answering the fundamental philosophical question about free will, which is, what's the correct account of free will? What does it take to have free will, right? Compatibilists and incompatibilists are going to go on to say different things about what it takes to have free will. We saw the 3 compatibilist requirements, and then we saw that the incompatibilist adds this requirement of real options, genuine alternative possibilities, right? So compatibilism and incompatibilism are your 2 basic positions in the free will debate. As I said, compatibilists typically think that humans have free will. Compatibilists typically think that humans do meet the conditions that they set out, and incompatibilists are kind of split, roughly 50-50. Some of them are libertarians and think humans do have free will sometimes, but a whole bunch are skeptics, right? And you might be a skeptic either because, as I said, you think there's good scientific evidence, that there's something about human beings in particular that means we lack free will. We'll talk about this in a second. Or you might be a skeptic. You might think that no human being ever has free will because no kind of creature at all could have free will because there's something about free will itself that's altogether impossible, right? You might be an incompatibilist about free will and causal determinism, right? So think you couldn't have free will in a causally deterministic world, but you might accept the luck objection to libertarian accounts of free will and then go on to say you also couldn't have free will in a world that's not causally deterministic. And since the world's either deterministic or not, that means you think that free will is just altogether impossible, right? But really briefly, I'm going to consider one way of being a skeptic by appeal to scientific evidence. And I'm saying this because I'm going over this because it's really common. It's really common to walk through a shop and see an issue of New Scientist or Scientific American that has a picture of the human brain on it, showing like electrical activity in the headline. You don't have free will. Science shows how, right? And often these sorts of articles that you see in magazines like that appeal to this sort of evidence right here. This is really popular evidence among scientists and even among some philosophers. So back, I think beginning in the 70s, the late 70s, but continuing since then, there were a series of experiments done in the first case by a guy named Benjamin Libet. And he wanted to ask the question, does the brain decide how we act, right? Does the brain decide what we're going to do, the choices we make and other behaviors we're going to perform long before we ourselves as a person are ever conscious of our making a decision to do that thing, right? So here's the setup. You're sitting in a chair, right? You're given these instructions, right? You're not supposed to think about it ahead of time. Don't plan in advance. Don't think about when to make this choice. But when you feel an urge creep up on you or something like that, you're supposed to spontaneously decide to flex your wrist, to make a simple movement like this, right? Really simple movement. You've got a sensor, electromyograph attached to your wrist. It's going to detect the time at which you moved, right? That muscular movement occurred. You've got sensors attached to the outside of your skull in this case, right? Electroencephalograph, EEG sensors that are going to detect brain activity, electrical activity in the relevant parts of the brain. So the parts of the brain that are thought to be responsible for motor activity like movements of my right wrist, like that, right? And while you've got these sensors attached, you're supposed to be looking at this clock that appears on the wall, right? There's an ordinary clock that has just a single hand on it, and the hand is going around maybe at that kind of speed, right? And what you're supposed to do is don't think about it ahead of time, but when you feel the urge or something like that, maybe just spontaneously decide. There's not supposed to be any pre-planning. Your decision is supposed to be spontaneous. When you decide to flex your wrist, you're supposed to observe the position of the hand on the clock, right? Make a quick mental note of where that hand was, and then report that to the experimenter, right? And what's going to happen then is the time, right, where the hand was on the clock is going to be compared to the time when your wrist actually moved, and that's going to be compared to the time when there was all this electrical activity in your brain, right? This is all in order to answer this question, does the brain decide before we're ever aware of a conscious decision to choose how to act, right? a conscious decision about how to act. So what Libet found, doing this experiment many times, right, over the course of years with hundreds or thousands of participants, suppose that the wrist movement, right, suppose that we stay at 0 seconds is the time when the wrist movement occurs, right, and then we're going to count backwards before 0. On average, given all these people participating in this experiment, on average, people reported themselves to make a choice to flex their wrist about 1/5 of a second, 200 milliseconds before 0, right? So 200 milliseconds, 1/5 of a second before their wrist actually flexed. That kind of makes sense, right? You might think that it takes some amount of time for a signal, right? If you make a decision and our mental activity is related in some way, intimately related to activity of our brain, right? Even if we're not quite sure how. You might think it takes some amount of time for a brain signal to travel through your limbs and result in muscular movement of in this part of your body, right, of your wrist and hand. But you might think 1/5 of a second, 200 milliseconds, is an awfully long time. But set aside that concern. They're trying to average this out over the course of many participants, and somehow they got 1/5 of a second, right? No real problem so far. So the movement happens at 0 seconds, and you feel that you're making a choice, right? People reported themselves to make a choice to flex their wrist 200 milliseconds, 1/5 of a second before that movement. But the key is that there was all this stuff happening in the brain, right? The EEG sensors on the outside of your skull detected that there was this ramp up, right? This surge in electrical activity in the relevant parts of the brain a full 350 milliseconds before you took yourself to be making a choice, right? Or 550 milliseconds, about half a second before the wrist movement actually occurred. So you've got the wrist movement at 0, you've got yourself, you've got a conscious awareness of a choice or intention to flex your wrist at minus 200 milliseconds, but you've got all this brain activity happening in the relevant parts of the brain at minus 550 milliseconds, right? And the conclusion is that that brain activity is correctly interpreted as the brain deciding, in some sense, or choosing unconscious to you that you're going to flex your wrist. And it's also the brain causing and bringing about your feeling that it's you making a choice at the minus 200 millisecond mark, right? And if that's right, if the brain is deciding all of these things in advance, then your choice, right, whatever feeling of choice you have at minus 200 milliseconds is just an illusion, right? It's not you that's really bringing about the wrist flexing, it's the brain, right? If the correct interpretation is that that brain activity is the brain causing all these things to happen. There's different ways of objecting to this kind of evidence. It's really popular evidence, right? A lot of scientists, there's been more sophisticated versions of this sort of experiment since Libet, but a lot of scientists think this is really good evidence. You can generalize from this very artificial sort of case where you're sitting in a chair deciding to flex your wrist. You can generalize from this to all instances of choice about what to do, right? And to the general conclusion that we never have free will. A lot of scientists think that conclusion follows from these sorts of experiments. Most philosophers think it's actually really crummy evidence. It's really bad evidence. Not so much that it's bad evidence, but a lot of philosophers point out that there's different ways of interpreting that brain activity. It might be the brain preparing, getting itself ready for you to make a choice, and then for it itself, the brain, to send a signal, right? Or it might be, you're sitting there, you're supposed to not plan in advance what to do, when to flex your wrist. But if you're supposed to be thinking about whether you feel an urge creep up on you to flex your wrist, or you're supposed to be, you might find it really difficult not to have some kind of thought about whether it's time to choose now or not, right? So there's different ways of interpreting what that brain activity is. And it need not be the case that we interpret it as the brain deciding, the brain causing and bringing about all this stuff. So the question is, are Libet's findings and are the findings of related, more sophisticated experiments, scientific experiments, really good scientific evidence against free will? Even if you're an incompatibilist and a skeptic about free will, typically people think there isn't really good definitive scientific evidence for or against free will just yet. We just don't know enough about the brain and about how the human mind works. So briefly, to recap, we've considered two questions. In the free will debate, there's the philosophical question. What does it take to have free will, right? What's the right account of free will? What does a creature have to be like to have free will? And this is a philosophical question because it's not a question that you can answer by doing the scientific method, right? By doing any kind of science. The second question is partly a scientific question. This is the question that we care about, right? We work on free will. We consider what it takes to have free will because we care about whether we have free will, because having free will, making choices that are in some important sense up to us or determined by us would mean we have a special kind of place in the world, right? A special kind of agency. And it would mean that moral responsibility is a warranted practice, right? Our practices of blaming and praising and punishing and rewarding people for the things they choose to do and the things they do is justified after all, right? So the second question, do humans ever have free will, is a scientific question in part because in addition to requiring an answer to the first question, it requires we know something about what human beings are like. So that it requires we pay attention to psychology and neuroscience and biology and so forth. Yeah, the overall purpose of this session was to give you an idea of what philosophy is, the kinds of questions that philosophers work on, and then to use the free will debate as kind of a case study to show how philosophy works and how it relates to work in the various sciences. Really quick, before I let you go, if you're interested in this stuff, if you're interested in free will, this guy here, Al Mealy on the right, is a professor of mine at my last program. Before I came to the UK to do a PhD, I was at Florida State, and he's a professor there, and he's had a pair of projects, the first of which was called Big Questions in Free Will, where he got something like $3.5 or $4 million from some organization to run this big 3-4 year project where he brought together a bunch of scientists and philosophers and theists as well, right? People working in religious studies, to talk about free will, to do experiments, and to answer these two questions, right? And to try to come to agreement on things. And I think it was PBS, which is sort of the kind of like the American version of the BBC, but much smaller, produced a documentary talking to him and interviewing people that participated in this project, both philosophers and scientists. And you can find it on YouTube. It's called Closer to Truth, Big Questions in Free Will. It's probably about an hour and a half long, and it's very accessible, right? It's meant to be something that somebody who's not worked in philosophy or worked on the free will debate can understand. So, yeah, if you want to learn more about this stuff, I would recommend starting with that right there. And, yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.